Hi there, I'm your host, John Iveson, and in a week where foreign interference has dominated the political agenda, I'm joined this week by Wesley Wark, who is a Senior Fellow at the Centre of International Governance Innovation, which is a think tank, and he's a former member of Canada's Advisory Council on National Security. In addition, he was an exceptional kids hockey coach, as my eldest son would attest, I'm sure. Wesley, hi.
John, great to be with you. Nice to see you.
So you spent a considerable number of hours watching the Hague Commission on Foreign Interference, essentially so that we don't have to. We're going to turn to the Prime Minister's testimony on Wednesday in a second, but I'm just wondering what your biggest takeaways are so far. Do you think that we have a concerning foreign interference problem when it comes to our electoral process?
John, I think the answer to that is concerning, yes, but not to the extent that I think that some of the initial media reports suggested, some of the political discourse has suggested, and certainly not anything that reaches to what the former CSIS director called an existential threat, though we could never really track down the source of that idea. So it's an ongoing concern. What I would say, and this has been my problem in a way with the public inquiry and its focus from the beginning. What I would say is that foreign interference takes many forms, and I don't think we're really paying attention to the most dangerous of them. The most dangerous of them does not, in my view, concern impacts on elections and related democratic processes. That's something that always has to be guarded against. But there are other forms of foreign interference that have been talked about within government for quite a long time, and strategies have been written and never published. But there are other more dangerous forms of foreign interference that we're not addressing. We've, to a certain extent, as valuable as the public inquiry has been, we've sort of dove down a rabbit hole in terms of the narrow focus of the inquiry.
So that's because the mandate is essentially about the electoral process rather than broader foreign interference when it comes to diaspora communities, for example, right?
Absolutely, and of course the mandate was formed in backroom discussions between all the political parties and the governing party, and it was very much based on, I think what has to be said, partisan political concerns and media leaks. I don't think anyone was really interested in exploring, what is the broad range of foreign interference threats, and should we have a public inquiry about all of them. The intense focus, as you recall, following the media leaks that started in the fall of 2022 and really rose to a crescendo in the spring of 2023, was the idea that China had somehow managed to bend and distort federal elections in 2019 and 2021 to its own advantage. And so the conspiracy theory went perhaps even to the advantage of the governing party.
Has the fact that there were concerns that airing sensitive information, intelligence information, might be a problem in a public inquiry, has that been a major impediment?
It hasn't, and I think it has been a pleasant surprise that it hasn't. The public inquiry has been able to do its work. David Johnson, who was appointed as the independent special rapporteur when he delivered his first report before his mandate went out in flames, recommended against a public inquiry because, as you know, he argued that a public inquiry based on so much sensitive intelligence reporting would not be able to really conduct its work in public. I think Justice Hague's commission has proven that wrong to a degree, to a degree that is useful. There's been a lot of documentation that's been declassified and released and is available on the public commission's website. A lot of testimony, some of it, based on in-camera examinations. There have been intelligence summaries that have been published that have been useful. So we've certainly had a look inside the secret tent in terms of what the government knows on the basis of its intelligence holdings about foreign interference, and that has really, I think, helped put the question of the scale and seriousness of this threat into a context which is useful and to a certain degree reassuring even.
You made a point last weekend. You were discussing the 54-day delay by the then Public Safety Minister, Bill Blair, to sign a CSIS warrant. I thought it was a point that was well taken, that it was more likely a cock-up than a conspiracy to protect the Liberal Party from bad publicity. Does the inquiry lead you to believe there are quite a lot of cock-ups when it comes to national security in this country?
Well, there certainly have been a number of them. It's hard to know what what a lot of them are. I mean, ideally there should be none. There certainly have been some sort of serious problems when it comes to, at least in the past, making sure that intelligence reporting from CSIS or other national security agencies made its way to senior officials, and from them to ministers. There were a lot of black holes in that process that were uncovered. And the government certainly took notice. It's not something they necessarily would have paid attention to if this hadn't come to light publicly, but fixes were required. And so a lot of work has gone into the business of making sure that intelligence reporting can now be tracked. In the past, some of it wasn't. It would just be sent to addresses and nobody would know really whether it got there or anybody read it. So kind of, putting junk mail in a mailbox. I mean, that was kind of the intelligence circulation model that used to exist. It was all disrupted, of course, by the pandemic as well, just to, to be realistic about some of the circumstances. But, discovering that important intelligence information either didn't get to the right desks or weren't read at all, or weren't signaled as important, was something that was brought to light, and the government has said that it's taken lots of steps and has detailed them. Prime Minister testified about them, taken a lot of steps to try and fix that dissemination problem. And one of the ways that they fixed it is really empowering a very senior official in the government, which perhaps most Canadians have never heard of, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, to be a kind of essential gatekeeper to make sure that the intelligence gets to the Prime Minister and Cabinet and is properly discussed. So a lot's riding on the ability of the National Security Intelligence Advisor, NSIAs, in the Ottawa sandbox to do that job. So that's one of the fixes. And intelligence reporting is now being tracked properly and is now mostly being streamed through a system that the communication security establishment has had for quite a long time. And a lot of it may sound antiquated, but it's a kind of fascinating system, or at least I find it fascinating. A lot of the intelligence is now carried around town in special pouches by people called CROWs, which stands for Client Relations Officers, and they provide their secret pouches with their documents inside them in paper to selected readers who have to read them in the presence of CROWs, and then CROWs take them away. So it's a very old-fashioned system, but it is secure and it's trackable. So that's the solution of the government.
Right. Ironic, given the improvements in communications, but I guess not secure communications. You mentioned the Prime Minister, so just to recap on yesterday, you wrote a piece that was quite complimentary about Trudeau's record as a national security Prime Minister, that in opposition he sought a balance between granting new powers to security agencies and more accountability. And that on the India issue in particular, he sought to use discreet diplomacy to solve the problem behind closed doors. I would argue he also has escalated the problem by making it public on the floor of the House of Commons and perhaps now escalating it again with this kicking out the Indian High Commissioner last week or this week. Do you think Trudeau could have played this any differently given the way the Indian government has been so aggressive?
John, it's a great question, and I take the point about escalation, and there have been escalatory steps that the Prime Minister has taken. First, the announcement in the House of Commons back in September 2023 on its first day of sitting, and then the most recent press conference on Thanksgiving Day that followed after the RCMP press conference about their knowledge of Indian foreign interference. What I would say, my own view on these escalations is that I think the government took them reluctantly. They would have preferred to continue to work behind the scenes, and they would have preferred to continue to work behind the scenes with Indian counterparts if they thought that the Indians were prepared to play ball. And I think what we saw on Thanksgiving with these announcements from the RCMP and the government ministers was a deep frustration that they just weren't getting anything from Indian officials. No willingness to dialogue, no willingness to take seriously, the Canadian intelligence that they had on Indian government official involvement in clandestine foreign interference in Canada. So I think they were pushed into into public escalation because they felt they had no choice. I would also say this really struck me about the RCMP press conference. It's just my own personal reading of it, but I have to say that I've never experienced in the past 20, 30 years an RCMP press conference where I felt the Mounties are afraid. They are afraid that something is really bad is going to happen on their watch. And they are coming out in public in a kind of unprecedented way. Usually they, as you'll know, they stay mum completely when investigations are ongoing. They felt they had to come out and say something in public to try and, as they said, disrupt these operations, kind of break the chain between Indian government officials and their proxies that they were using, and even criminal gangs that they were using operating in Canada. But escalation can be a rational calculation that can be driven by fear, and I think there was a combination of those two things at work.
This is not to excuse what is clearly illegal and reprehensible behaviour by the Indian government. I mean, it's pretty clear that they have been assassinating people and intimidating Indian Canadians. But what struck me was how quickly this relationship has unravelled. I mean, I remember when Modi came to Ottawa in 2015, we were the best of friends. And somehow this relationship has now got to the point where we're essentially engaged in a diplomatic war with the Indians. It's not clear to me how we can protect national security or repair this relationship. Do you think we just have to rely on allies like the Americans? And are they going to put their bilateral relations with India at risk on our behalf? It seems to me that is unlikely.
Yeah, it's good question. I mean, I think one of the calculations that the Trudeau government was deploying as it went public increasingly with its concerns was that allies would stand behind them. And we've seen the extent to which the United States government has indicated that they are prepared to press India to encourage them to cooperate with the Canadian investigation. There's been a statement from the UK Foreign Ministry along those lines as well. More muted statements from Australia and New Zealand, but among the key Five Eyes partners, a sense of solidarity there, which I think the Trudeau government gambled on. I think what will ultimately solve this war of words are two things. One is, and they'd be a combination. One is the United States, of course, is putting its own pressure on New Delhi to, in the light of the unsealed indictment that the American Department of Justice issued that implicated actually more than one Indian government official in covert activities and assassination plots in the United States. So the U.S. has its own case that it's pursuing with the Indians, and it's already forced the Indian government to bend a bit by agreeing to mount some kind of private internal investigation into these matters. And I think the Canadians are hoping that ultimately India will bend in a similar fashion to the way in which it's bent in the face of U.S. demands. But what will really turn the page, and it will be difficult for the Modi government to manage this, but not impossible given the nature of this government, the Modi government is going to have to find its way out of what I call its plausible deniability box. It's going to have to find a way of saying, yes, this happened, but, well, we really didn't authorize it. It was some set of rogue agents, or the Prime Minister wasn't aware and wouldn't have condoned it. They're going to have to back down in some public way in that fashion, while still saving face with their own domestic audience and still putting holding to this pretty tough line about wanting to ensure that Indian sovereignty is protected from threats abroad. It was interesting to me, just the last point on this, that in the RCMP press conference, one of the things it was really prepared to say was, we recognize there's an extremist threat in Canada, and we are prepared to work with India on that. So it was a gesture that the RCMP was clearly hoping the Indians might take up, if not right now, at least in the future, for some better working relationship to deal with what has long been an Indian concern, that Canada is a kind of safe haven for extremist Khalistani separatist actors.
Yeah. Just go back to Justin Trudeau's appearance yesterday. The most inflammatory point was when he said he was bewildered that Pierre Poilievre would not seek security clearance or receive briefings on what Trudeau alleged were current and former Conservatives who were somehow engaged in foreign interference. What do you make of that? I mean, is Poilievre justified in saying that if he accepted those briefings and sought security clearance, his hands would be tied? Or do you find it odd that he has not sought that clearance?
John, I have to say I find it very odd, and I'll try not to, duplicate the Prime Minister's language, bewildering, incomprehensible, lacking in common sense. To me, it just doesn't make any sense. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is that I've had a high level security clearance and I know what you can do and not do with it. It would not prevent, if Pierre Poilievre had a top secret clearance, it would not prevent him finding ways to use that information without betraying it. And that's part of the day-to-day lives of any officials operating in the public domain who have such clearances. It's not rocket science to figure out how to do that. And it is also, I think it has to be said, it's not a new accusation from Justin Trudeau or the Liberal Party and other ministers that Pierre Poilievre is behaving irresponsibly by not getting a security clearance. That piece of the testimony wasn't new. What was new was the kind of additional flame that was poured on this fire, whereby Justin Trudeau said he knew the names of a number of Conservative parliamentarians, he didn't say MPs or senators, who were implicated, according to the intelligence information that he had, in foreign interference. And of course also called attention to the fact, he posed it as a question, well, why is Pierre Poilievre not interested in finding out more about foreign interference in his own election races? Now, this is obviously a political point. It's a partisan statement. What Justin Trudeau is trying to demonstrate is that he is the kind of responsible statesperson that can lead a country through a national security crisis. And that was also, he was trying to put that on display in terms of talking about and going through in considerable detail the government's response to its knowledge of Indian foreign interference. We're at an interesting point, I think. I mean, Justin Trudeau is in danger with his own caucus. There's an election looming. He seems determined to stay in office. Well, who knows? That could change day by day. But we've come to a very unusual inflection point in Canadian political history whereby national security becomes a test for leadership. And Justin Trudeau was trying, I think, if you step back from some of these accusations, the point of his testimony was not just to defend his record, but it's to say, I'm the best political leader to govern Canada in a time of turbulence around national and international security. And Pierre Poilievre, who he says seems anxious to, come into power, he says Pierre Poilievre is just demonstrating no ability to serve as the leader of a country facing multiple national security crises. So it's an electioneering point that I think is fascinating because we usually don't think about elections in terms of the person who ultimately appoint to lead a government. Is that person capable of managing a country in a national security crisis? We never ask ourselves that question. It's being asked now.
Yeah, for sure. The Conservative mantra now is to call for Trudeau to name those names. These are the names of people who were in the part of the NCCOP, which is the National Committee of Parliamentarians report, who are alleged to be either witting or semi-witting accomplices to foreign powers. I do remember Dominic LeBlanc, the now Public Safety Minister, saying at committee that the names listed were based on uncorroborated information, essentially saying that it was basically unreliable information, which somewhat undermines Trudeau's point of even mentioning it yesterday, but also would suggest that naming those names is not a good idea. What's your stance on that?
Well, first of all, I would say, I mean, I have lots to say about the idea of naming names in a democracy, and with a historian with some memory of past decades and McCarthyism and so on. I think this is a terrible idea, but I'll say a bit more about why in a minute. First of all, I think it's pretty clear that Poilievre shot back by saying, well, Trudeau should name the names, because Poilievre knows he won't. So it's an easy political point to make, and then he combined it with a charge that Justin Trudeau is not going to name the names, and anyway, he's lying. We've come to that point in our national discourse that the leader of a government would lie about a national security threat. Okay, well, that's where we are. It's not a place that any Canadian would want us to be, and this is just the way in which partisanship has rocketed through the roof on these issues. There have been lots of proposals, including from the NDP's Jenny Kwan, who herself has been a target of foreign interference, to find a way to name names in Parliament. I just don't think this flies, and I don't think it flies because, first of all, as you say, the identification of MPs who may be involved in some way or another, to some degree or another, in foreign interference schemes is based on intelligence, and it's not that the intelligence is necessarily unreliable; it's just that it's incomplete. And it's not the same as evidence. It's not the kind of thing you could present in a court of law. The second point is really that, well, if you've found some way to stand up in the public square and name names, the people who are going to be named names will be defenseless. I mean, they will have no recourse except to say, I'm innocent. They wouldn't be able to prove their innocence because they wouldn't have access to any of the intelligence that may finger them in some way or another. And I would just underline this all by saying that in a democracy, surely cooler heads could prevail, and we would say to ourselves that if there are, strong indications of parliamentarians betraying their trust, betraying their oath of office, and when these amount to criminality, you bring them before the courts and you let the courts do their work. That is the way that democracies have to work. And I really find offensive the idea that we should be conducting public flagellation in the public square.
Right. I mean, witch hunt is a pretty accurate description. Just to round things off, Wesley, David Johnson's report, you mentioned it earlier, but it's all but forgotten. It was the first report on foreign interference back in May 2023. He concluded, to quote him, there was no convincing evidence that the Prime Minister failed to act on recommendations from the security agencies. Have you heard anything during the course of this inquiry that is at odds with that assessment?
I haven't. We'll have to see what ultimately Justice Hogue reports, but there's certainly been no surfacing of indications of that kind. David Johnson, I think, did a real service. In this initial report, he wasn't able to complete his mandate. And it goes beyond, trying to dial down the temperature on foreign interference concerns with the kinds of findings he came up with. But there were really deep criticisms built into his report as well, particularly around this issue of intelligence going missing in action. And he was very strong about that. He appreciated the significance of that, and he wanted to pursue it. Didn't have a chance to. He was also, very strong on the idea that what any kind of inquiry needs to do is really understand the impact of foreign interference on diaspora communities. And that was something he said he was going to really pursue in his stage 2, which again didn't happen. I think what we will discover through this process, and it was partly embedded in David Johnson's first report, and he won no friends, of course, by saying, I've looked at all the media reports based on the leaks, I've compared them to the intelligence evidence. Media reporting is exaggerated. The media didn't like that. And opposition parties didn't really believe it. So on we went to a public inquiry. But I think we can see, even in Justice Hogue's interim report, that there is, first of all, no evidence that foreign interference had any serious impact on federal elections in 2019 and 2021. And secondly, that there is certainly no evidence to back the conspiracy theory that the Liberal government, for example, sort of sat back and let this happen in front of their noses because in some way or another they benefited from it. And that was one of the more dire but politically inspired conspiracy theories that circulated. So I think what we'll hear from Justice Hogue in December is that foreign interference is an ongoing threat. There are ways in which we can strengthen our resilience to it. But I think she will be confronted with the task of taking the NCCOP report, which you mentioned, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, and their allegations about witting and semi-witting accomplices. And she's going to have to take that and put it in context. How serious is this? What does it really mean? Because in the course of her recent public hearings, she's heard a lot of evidence, including from CSIS, that and from ministers who might be a bit more partisan in this, that the NCCOP report stretched the truth. And when CSIS was asked by the public inquiry to go back into its own records and kind of come up with its own appreciation of how many incidents of foreign interference could it identify, what are the most significant and serious of them, they went back through it and they came up with a total of 6 instances over 6 years. Is that a serious record? Well, someone needs to put that in perspective. Elizabeth May, of course, looked at the NCCOP classified report and said she was reassured. Jagmeet Singh looked at it and said he was scared to death. So we need a sort of sober, grounded, objective, if possible, reflection on just how serious has this threat been in the past. And I think the message will be not as serious as we've all taken it to be. How serious might it be in the future will be an interesting projection.
Well, that is somewhat reassuring, I think. So we're out of time. Wesley, thank you very much for your time and for your expertise. Be well.
Thank you so much, John.
All the best.